Hello. So, we are going today to really delve into the topic of Yovel and what Yovel is all about. And it works very nicely after a discussion of Shmita and also after Gloria's discussion of different economic models in general. And I really want to start with where we left off last time, which was really different discussions of Shmita in Chumash. We looked at 3 different places in Chumash where Shmita occurs and talked about how in each of those places you really get a different perspective on Shmita. So where we had Shmot, where it was all about social justice, and Dvarim, where the focus was really on remission of debt. And then in Vayikra, where we had this idea of Shmita being really for God and about God and recognizing that God owns the land. The section on Yovel is really in Vayikra, and it comes right after the section about Shmita. Just a quick, we're going to actually start with the section on Yovel, but I put the section on Shmita here just as kind of a quick reminder for everybody. And if you take a look at the bold there, you see that Shmita being Shabbat LaHashem and Shabbat Shabbaton, and the whole idea of Shmita being really God rested on the 7th day, so therefore what do? We let our land rest, very much like what happens on Shabbat. And it's about recognizing that God owns the land, right? It's not explicitly really about social justice. It's really about recognizing that God owns the land. And then right after that comes a rather lengthy section about Yovel and also in general about supporting the poor and what happens when people are impoverished, which is very much connected to Yovel. So what we're going to do mostly today is really take an in-depth look of that section in Vayikra that talks about Yovel, and then we're going to look at a couple of other places in Tanakh where Yovel, the idea of Yovel appears. So that's the idea of what we're going to do. So I'm gonna read the first section, starting with pasuk chet. So skipping down to where it says Yovel there. Yes, here we go. Got it. Okay. V'safarta lecha sheva shabbatot shanim, sheva shanim, sheva pamim, vayu lecha yemei sheva shabbatot hashanim, tesha v'arba'im shana. So you should count, right? 7 Shabbatot, 7 times 7, and you see how many times it says 7 here, by the way? And then that will take you to 49 years. So you have 7 Yovels, right? 7 Shmitot. And then at the end of 7 Shmitot, what do? V'ha'avarta shofar t'vorah b'chodesh hashvi'i be'asor la'chodesh b'yom ha'kippurim ta'aviru shofar b'chol artzachem. Right? When does Yovel start? After Yom Kippur. And how do you know that Yovel starts? Well, you actually blow the trumpet. Yovel literally means, right, is the ram's horn. Okay, so it's named after how it starts, which is as opposed to with Shmita, where Shmita just kind of happens, right? It's just the 7th year. What happens with Yovel? Yovel you actually have to announce. There's a proclamation that you have to make for Yovel. Right, and that's made very clear in Pasuk Yud. V'hidashtem et shnat ha'chamishim shana, ukratem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveha, Yovel hi tiyeh lechem, v'shavtem ish el achuzato, v'ish el mishpachto tashuvu. So you should make holy the 50th year and pronounce freedom in the land. It is a Yovel. And what happens in this Yovel? Every person goes back to their original land, to their original achuzah, and to their original family. Yovel hi shnat ha'chamishim shana tiyeh lechem, lo tizra'u, v'lo tikturu et tzvicha, v'lo tivtzeru et niziraha. And what do you do on Yovel? Very similar to Shmita, you're not allowed to work the land on Yovel. Ki Yovel hi chodesh tiyeh lechem, min hasadeh tochlu et tvuata, b'shnat hayovel hazot tashuvu ish el achuzato. And again, this idea of everybody going back to their family. And then it says, V'chi timkru mimkar la'amitecha, o kano miyad amitecha, al tonu ish et achiv. If you sell something to your friend, do not oppress them. What does that mean, do not oppress them? That becomes much clearer in the next 2 psukim. B'mispar shanim achar hayovel tikne me'en amitecha, b'mispar Shnei tvuot yimkar lach. Lefi rov hashanim tarben miknato, lefi maot hashanim tan'it miknato. Ki mispar tzvot hu mocher lach. Because all land is returned at the end of the 50th year, right? I'm sorry, at the beginning of the 50th year, the land is returned. What happens if you actually sell land? The pasuk makes it very clear. You're actually not selling land. If I sell land in year 30, right? What I'm actually doing when I sell my land is I'm not selling actual land. I'm selling essentially 20 years of harvests. Okay? So it's making very clear here that I have to set the price of my land according to the price of the amount of harvest that I'm selling, not according to any other number. And that's why it says, Lo tonu, don't oppress anyone. And then it says it again in Pasuk Yud Zayin. In other words, you have to set the price in a very fair way. Pasuk Yud Zayin again, Lo tonu ish et amito, don't oppress anybody, right? V'yareita me'elokecha, and you should fear God. In Chumash, when it says V'yareita me'elokecha, it says it by unenforceable laws. What does that mean? Right? Nobody's going to be in charge of exactly who's setting the prices for what. You need to fear God, right? Because God is going to notice if you do this. Somebody else might, nobody else might notice. So you have the same V'yareita me'elokecha when it says if you see a lost object, don't just walk by. Okay? Nobody else is going to notice if you walk by a lost object, and don't try to return it, but God will. V'yareita me'elokecha. Ki ani Hashem Elokecha. Okay, 2 more psukim, then we're going to stop and talk about this. V'asitem chugotai v'mishpatai tishmeru, v'asitem otam v'yashavtem al haaretz levatach. So you should keep my commandments, and then keeping my commandments will allow you to dwell in this land. V'natnach haaretz piryah, v'achaltem l'sova, v'yashavtem levatach aleha. Okay, and that is what's going to enable the land to bear its fruit and have enough. Okay, basic laws of Yovel. Number 1, people return to their ancestral land. Number 2, slaves go free. And the slaves going free, that's the kratim drawer, right? There will be freedom in the land, right? It's the pasuk that's on the Liberty Bell, actually. The psukim we're going to see later also emphasize that a lot more. So those are the 2 basic, really basic laws of Yovel. Yovel is both like Shemitah and not like Shemitah. Okay, it's not called Shabbat, which is interesting, right? It's sort of above Shabbat. It's the 50th year. It's not part of the 7-year cycle. And as I mentioned before, Yovel has this idea of you actually have to declare it. People have to declare it. It doesn't just happen. There's another very important distinction, which is it is very clear in the psukim that Shemitah is for everyone. Shemitah is very explicitly for the ger. It is for the ezrach. Anybody can come into the land. Yovel is actually just for Jews. Okay? Why is that? Why is Yovel just for Jews, right? Yovel is just for Jews because Yovel is about people returning to their ancestral land. And we're talking here about people who have an achuzah in the land, people who have a claim to the territory in the land, and the people that had a claim to the territory in the land were Jews. Okay? So we're really talking specifically about Jews, and we're talking also very specifically about Eretz Yisrael. Okay? So it makes sense, really, why the focus is only specifically on Bnei Yisrael. Why does Yovel begin on Yom Kippur and not Rosh Hashanah? Any thoughts?
We don't blow the shofar.
We do.
We do blow the shofar,
But not in the same way.
Well, I think that might be one answer. In other words, like you want to kind of separate the 2 blowings of the shofar, right? You don't want to have confusion between one blowing of the shofar and another blowing. Like the shofar in Rosh Hashanah is for one thing, and the shofar in Yovel is for something very different. Okay, and by the way, the whole reason we blow shofar now on Yom Kippur is from this idea of them blowing shofar. There's no mitzvah to blow in the Torah to blow shofar on Yom Kippur except for Yovel. Okay, so it's sort of an artifact from the idea that they would blow shofar on Yovel, the end of Yom Kippur.
Is it finalizing a decree? In other words, the verdict is, you sign on the verdict, even though we have till Hoshana Rabbah to Tshuva, but it's signing on the verdict, and same thing with Yovel, it's starting now. is, no.
Yeah, I think there's something to like the end, right? The end of Yom Kippur is the end, really the end of like the whole Rosh Hashanah time period, right? And it's the end of, it's really after the kapara has happened. And if you notice the word v'kidashtem is used, right? It has to be made holy. And maybe you can't make it holy until everyone's already done their kapara, like after you've done your personal kapara, after you've done your communal kapara. So now we're ready to enact this whole new societal change. And I mean, it's huge. Think about what that actually means, right? Okay, you have a slave, your slave goes free. You return to your ancestral land. Like your whole life, everyone's life is upturned. Some people in very good ways, and some people probably in ways that are very difficult for them. Either way, your whole life is upturned. So it's kind of you have Yom Kippur, and then there's like this clean break, and then everything changes. Which is a very, if you think about this in practicality, it's this amazing thing. So the question, what is Yovel really about, right? Yovel is really about this, as presented in these psukim. It's a resetting of the clock, right? It gives people have 50 years, and they have the opportunity to essentially do what they can for themselves, build themselves up, right? We have more or less a capitalist society. Every 7 years you have Shmita, which is really this opportunity to even out, level off the playing field a little bit. But even with Shmita, right, what do you have with Shmita? You have the, either cancellation of debts or postponement of debt, whichever way you want to look at it. But it might really not be enough. Why is it not enough? Because bottom line, if you don't own land, you don't have a permanent means of sustenance. So what does Yovel do? What Yovel does is it kind of allows us to reset the clock. So it permits this capitalist society, but then what does it do? It says every 50 years we restart. How do we restart? We give everyone land every 50 years. So we make sure.
Everyone, or just those whose parents owned land? I mean, there were always poor people without land.
So you would go back to your ancestral family. So if you think about, right, everyone, and there's tremendous machloket as to how did this actually occur and what were the practicalities of this and how far back are we going, right? And there's this huge debate among biblical scholars also as to is this, because people look at this law and say this is totally utopian, right? Did this actually, how do you pull this off? Did this actually happen? But yes, in the Torah, the idea really is ushaftem ish la'achuzato. It really says people return to their ancestral lands. It's a very familial kind of thing.
In the time of the Shvatim, that ancestral land.
Correct.
Okay, that's why everyone
Correct. That's why everyone has a piece. In other words, the idea is everyone, right, Yovel, everyone gets a piece. And so you are starting with the idea of, over 50 years, some people are going to do okay for themselves and some people are not going to do okay for themselves, right? And when they don't do okay for themselves, we start over. Which is a really interesting idea. There is a parallel kind of law. I shouldn't say it's law. There was something that ancient Mesopotamian kings used to do every once in a while called misaru, which is similar to Yovel, in that what they would do is remit debts. So very often when a king ascended to the throne, he would say, here's my welcome gift to everybody. And what would the welcome gift be? He would say, all debts are canceled, there's no taxes for a year, whatever it might be, okay? And so scholars compare this a lot to the Yovel in a very interesting way and say, what's different about Yovel is, number one, it's not for a particular class of society. It's not for the nobles, it's not, right? It's for everybody. And number two, it is cyclical. So it's not dependent on the whims of this particular king or that particular king. It's saying no, this is really built into the process and that this is every 50 years. So it's a very interesting kind of, it's a really interesting comparison when you think about it. Okay, so getting back to the psukim. The psukim now try to get a little bit practical and say, well, wait a second. Yovel's at the end of 49 years, okay? So the year before Yovel's what? Shmita. So what's the problem?
It's 2 years in a row.
2 years in a row, right? Maybe I can survive 1 year, but how in the world am I going to be able to do this for 2 years? Okay? Meaning everything that I plant in year number 6 has to last me now for
2 years.
7 and 8. Now that's a lot. Okay, and the Torah addresses that directly. So here it is in Pasuk Chaf, right? V'chi tomru ma nochal b'shana hashvi'it. So you're going to say, what am I going to eat on the 7th year? Hein lo nizra v'lo na'asov et tvuatenu. I'm not allowed to plant. So now it's addressing it by the 7th year, but it's going to go into what happens on Yovel also. V'tziviti et birchati lachem b'shana hashishit. I'm going to bless you enough on the 6th year, right? V'asita tvota. It's under where it says what to eat. There. There we go. Okay? And what's going to happen? Uzra'atem et hashana shmit v'achaltem min hatzvua yashan ad hashana hatchi'it ad bo tvu'ata tochlu yashan v'ha'aretz lo timacher litzmitut kili ha'aretz. And basically says land is not going to be sold in perpetuity. Why? Kikirim, tzmitut means perpetuity, like forever. You can't sell the land forever. Land is not to be sold. If you sell land, it's not permanent. Okay? Why? Kili haaretz, kigirim v'toshavim atem imadi. Because land belongs to God, and people are just sojourners with God. Uv'chol eretz achuzarchem gula titnu la'aretz. So what's the answer that's given here? Right? The crop of the 6th year is supposed to last you. And that counts not just for Shemitah, but that also counts for even if it's a Yovel. Now that is an explicit addressing of, hey, is this actually practical? And the answer is kind of, well, it's actually not practical, except for that what? God will take care of you. That's really the answer. Kind of explicitly, right? If you keep this mitzvah, God will actually take care of you. And then again, we have this idea here that I think is very interesting, right? This is not presented as social justice. This is, right, you cannot sell land forever, not because we need to make sure that everyone can support themselves, but ki li haaretz ki girim v'toshavim atem imadi, because we're just sojourners, right? We're just visitors, really, right? God really owns the land. So it's not like Devarim and it's not like Shmot, where Shemitah is presented explicitly as social justice. And you would think even like Yovel for sure would be presented as social justice, because why? Because we're giving people land, okay? But it's actually not. It's actually, you cannot really sell land ever. Why can't you really sell land? Because God owns land, okay? So the whole idea, and it isn't explicitly presented as social justice, but it is totally social justice, okay? Why isn't it presented explicitly? Because here we have, this is very important, the idea that social justice is derived from God's ownership, right? So you don't have this kind of bifurcation between mitzvot that are focused on people and mitzvot that are focused on God. What do you have here? You have every social justice is derived from the fact that I cannot, claim, I don't have claim to anything more than you do, right? Because we are all servants of God. Okay, and I think that's a very powerful idea, I think, here. Again, it's interesting just to point out, right, when it says ki li haaretz, in this context, the land belongs to me. What land belongs to God in this context? Everything. Well, here actually it's interesting, right? We normally think that it's everything. Here, what are we talking about? We're talking really about Eretz Yisrael, right? Because I was hoping somebody would say that, because that's how we usually answer that question, right? But here it's actually Eretz Yisrael, which is interesting. Okay, so that's really about what Yovel is about. Now, God owns the land. We cannot have permanent claim to it, and therefore, every 50 years it goes back. Now, the next, what Vayikra does now is it goes into kind of 3 stages of poverty, and how Yovel helps address in each of these stages. Okay, and it's going to talk a little bit more about the idea of freeing slaves. So let's take a look at what's going on here. So poverty stage 1, partial loss of land. Okay, someone want to read? You can read in the English if you want. It's It's fine. Any
Want me to
volunteers?
try the thing?
Go for it. Either one.
Okay. כי ימוך אחיך ומכר מאחוזתו ובא גואלו הקרוב אליו, גואלו הקרוב אליו, וגאל את ממכר אחיו. ואיש כי לא יהיה לו גואל, והשיגה ידו ומצא כדי גאולתו. וחישב את שני ממכרו והשיב את העודף לאיש אשר מכר לו. ושב לאחוזתו. ואם לא מצא ידו, די השיב לו, והיה ממכרו ביד הקונה אותו, עד שנת היובל. ויצא ביובל ושב לאחוזתו.
Okay, so what's going on here? Basically, you have right, we're talking about an agricultural society. So you have a farmer. And what happened to the farmer? The farmer became poor. Right? How does a farmer become poor? Well, the farmer's crops fail. Okay? So when a farmer's crops fail, what does the farmer do? The farmer takes out a loan in order to buy seed. Okay, so this farmer took out a loan in order to buy seed, planted the seed, what happened? Failed. So now, in order to pay back the loan, what's the farmer's only way of paying back the loan? Selling land. So here it's very clear, right? This is a partial loss of land because it says umachar me'achuzato, right? He sells from his inheritance or from his claim. So the farmer sells part of his land. Now it's very clear this is a last resort, right? You don't sell land unless you really, really have to because that's what you have, right? Land is also where people buried people on their lands, right? So land is like really about a family possession. Okay, now, it's very interesting. What does it say here? Right, the first thing is, Vago aloha karovela v'ga'al minchar achiv. What's the first thing that can happen? If I need to sell my lands, right, then the first right, actually, of redeeming my land might be one of my relatives can come and buy back the land from the person to whom I sold it, okay? So, and that has nothing to do with Yovel, right? If I sell it today, one of my relatives can come and buy it back. They don't have to buy it back. They can buy it back, okay?
Does the man have to give it to them back?
Yes, that is what it is, right? Meaning they have the right, right? A redeemer has the right to purchase the land back at the price that it was sold, okay? So that's actually very interesting, right? So if I sell my land for, I don't know, $10, okay, it's very cheap, okay, and so the person my relative can come anytime and buy it back from the person to whom I sold it, okay?
Even if they don't want to sell it?
Even if they don't want to sell it. In other words, that's part of the, that is part of the, thank you, that's part of the condition of a sale. Okay, and again, this idea of lands remaining in the family and in its really in the ancestral family. Okay, now it also says, and it's kind of interesting, right? Now I can also if I don't have a redeemer, I can also buy it back if, let's say, my crops start doing well and I get enough money 2 years later to buy it back. I can also buy back my land. Now, it's interesting. That comes after the first pasuk, which says that my family member can buy it back. Why? Because it's probably more likely. It's not even about first dibs, right? It's probably more likely, the more likely situation, right? If I'm impoverished and my land's not doing well, the more likely situation is going to be that I have a, rich uncle who's doing fine and is going to be able to buy my land back. It's probably less likely that
I'll be able to do it.
Now, notice, the rich uncle who buys my land back doesn't give it to me. Okay?
He's
so,
no fool.
Huh?
He's no fool. He wants it.
Okay, doesn't give it to me, meaning I get it back eventually, but not quite yet. Okay? Now, what happens if nobody can buy it back? Okay? V'haya mimkaro, last pasuk there, biad hakonato ad shnat hayovel, v'yatza beyovel, v'shav le'achuzato. So when do I, as the landowner, really get my land back? if none of these things, other things can happen, right? In Yeovil. So in other words, Yeovil is kind of like a last resort, right? I can sell my land, but eventually, right? And somebody can redeem it, but eventually I will get it back in Yeovil. Okay? So Yeovil's the case kind of where God intervenes if I can't intervene earlier, really, is what's going on in these psukim. Okay? Now, interestingly, the next piece of this is the Torah differentiates between land that is in a field and houses that are in cities. Okay? So let's take a look. The next couple of psukim, someone want to read this? You can read it in the English, that's fine. Starting with Chavtet, the next section. Go ahead.
No one else?
Go.
ואיש כי ימכור בית מושב איש חומה והייתה גאולתו עד תום שנת ממכרו. ימים תהיה גאולתו.
Yeah, keep going.
ואם לא יגאל עד מלאת לא שנה תמימה, וקם הבית אשר בעיר אשר לא חומה לצמיתות לקונה אותו לדורותיו. לא יצא ביובל. ובתי החצרים אשר אין להם חומה, סביב עד שדה הארץ יחשב. גאולה תהיה לו וביובל יצא.
Okay, so we're actually going to stop there and you continue to talk about the Levim. What's going on here? It says if you sell a house that's in a city, actually that doesn't go back to its original owner in Yeovil. And the period to which a redeemer can come or to which I can buy it back if I lose my property in a city is 1 year. Why differentiate between land outside a city and land in a house in a city? Why would there be a totally different halakha? Why wouldn't it go back on Yeovil?
Because the land keeps giving.
Exactly. Bingo. Okay, because if this is really about people needing sustenance and making sure that everyone in society has economic viability, right? A house is not going to do that in the same way that land is, okay? That real property is going to, right? So when we apply this law to urban cities, what we're saying essentially is we don't need to protect houses in a town the same way that we need to protect people's fields, right? So then you could ask, well, why even have a 1 year period? Well, why have a 1 year period? Because it gives a period for somebody to kind of recover and get back on their feet. But we don't need the same idea of land returning in Yeovil. Which I think is really, really interesting. Okay, so that was the first stage of poverty, right? Somebody loses part of their land and they have the opportunity to get it back, or somebody from the family can redeem it, and then none of that works, they really get it back in Yeovil. Stage 2, here's what happens in stage 2. Keep going down. Okay, person loses their land entirely. So here we go, Pasuk Lamed He. Yeah. Okay, I'll read. V'chi yamuch achicha, u'matay yado imach, v'hechazakta bo, ger v'toshav v'chai imach. Al tikach me'ito neshach v'tarbit, v'yareta me'elokecha, v'chai achicha imach. Kasvecha lo titel no b'neshach, v'marbit lo titein achlecha. Ani Hashem elokecha, masher hotzeti etchem me'aretz Mitzrayim, l'tei lechem me'aretz Canaan, li'ol lechem Elohim. Okay, so what happens here? So stage 2, right? This person had, and I think it's interesting to read this as actually like stages of the same person. So here this person sold part of their land, right? And then what happens? The farmer has a crop failure on the reduced land. Okay? Now if you have a crop failure then on the reduced land, eventually what's going to happen? You're going to have to sell all your land, right? Because that's the only way, if you keep taking out money, right, the only thing you have to give back if your crops are failing is land, okay? Yeah. So the farmer's then is going to lose all of his land, right? He has to take out a new loan, he defaults. Okay, now notice this situation is not unlikely in Eretz Yisrael agriculturally, right? Because Eretz Yisrael is entirely dependent on rainfall, right? You don't have the Nile River, you don't have like permanent irrigation, right? So because it's entirely dependent on rainfall, this is not an unlikely crazy situation that this farmer is going to keep having trouble. Okay, so what's fascinating about this is what happens to a person who loses all their land. Okay, what happens, right? And what does it say actually, right? The farmer still works on the land like a tenant farmer. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that the farmer actually keeps the produce. In other words, the farmer works. The farmer keeps doesn't own the actual land, but does own his work.
His crop.
Okay, his crop. So eventually, right, can the farmer kind of gain back? Yes, if the crop does well. Okay, so if things are going okay, right, the produce that the farmer is working for may eventually pay back the loan. Or if it doesn't, what will happen? Well, in Yovel, the farmer will get back his land. Okay, it's very interesting. And if you take a look at the lashon of the psukim in pasuk lamed hey, the first pasuk there, right? It says v'chiamuch achicha, right? He is very poor, right? Umataya do imach, right? And he fails. V'hechazakta bo. And v'hechazakta bo can mean two different things. V'hechazakta bo, right, from the language of chazak, can either mean you need to uphold him, right? Or it can mean v'hechazakta bo, you take ownership of him, which is two entirely different ways of looking at the same thing, right? Either way, there's some way in which, as a tenant farmer, this man is now under your possession, really, except you don't really own him, right? He has the right to work what is now your land. You own the land, he owns the produce. Okay? Why throw in this business in Pasuk Lamed Chad about Ani Hashem Elokeichem Asher Tzeitichem Me'aretz Mitzrayim?
Because you better keep this, because I am in control there.
Yeah, I'm in control, but it's not just about, like, you better keep this because I am in control. Why the Mitzrayim piece of this?
You were once very poor.
Right, you were once very poor, you were once slave. This person is not an indentured servant to you, right? This person is somebody who is living on your land and working your land and gets to keep the produce. Okay, so that's very important here. Okay, now, stage 3.
Excuse me, what is Neshech and Marbit here? Why are they talking about taking
So that's exactly what this is, meaning
yeah.
you cannot take from him, he's allowed to keep the crop, okay? And Neshech and Tarbit are probably two different types of interest. One is interest at the beginning of that somebody would collect at the beginning of the loan, and one is interest somebody would collect at the end of a loan. And what this is saying is you have to let him take the crop, and you cannot actually demand anything else from him, right? He needs to pay it back to you, and that's it. Okay, so next piece. Next piece is slavery, okay, essentially. Which is what happens still, okay, if he cannot pay it back and he's unable to support himself and his family from the crops that he's collecting, that he's farming, okay? So it's not just that he can't pay back a loan, but he's actually he can't feed himself, okay? Because things are just really not going well. He can't feed himself. So then what happens, right? V'chiamuch achicha imach v'nimkar lach lo ta'avod bo avodat aved. So the first thing is you're not allowed to really
make him work.
Make him a slave. What does that mean? Kisachir ketosha v'yeh imach. What do you have to do? So now he will forfeit. He forfeits his right to the produce, which the truth is wasn't helping him very much anyway, right? If he can't support himself on it, he forfeits his right to the produce, and now he becomes a paid laborer. Okay, so it's slavery, but it's not really slavery. What does that mean? This is a person who now lives on your land and collects wages from you, gets a salary from you, right? Ad Shnat HaYovel Yavod Imach, and he stays with you until Yovel. Well, what happens in Yovel? He gets his property back. Okay? And then again, we have this pasuk, Ki avadai heim asher hotzeiti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim lo yimachru me'eret aved. Okay? Because Bnei Yisrael are the
former slaves?
Right?
Yes.
Are the slaves of God. What does that
Okay.
mean? Bnei Israel can only be slaves of God. So again, this idea of we can't really own land because God owns land. We can't really be slaves because we are to any humans because we're already slaves to God. Again, not presented as social justice. Presented as very God-focused. But the whole idea of social justice derives from the fact that God owns the land. We can't make God is in charge of us, right? We're slaves of God. I have no right to have power over anyone else's property. I have no right to have permanent power over anyone else's body. Okay? So those two things are very, very important. And then it goes on. Just to be very clear, it says pasuk mem gimel. We'll read one more pasuk of this. Lo tirdeh bo befarach, right? Do not work him too hard, right? And that word befarach is familiar to us from Mitzrayim, right?
Yes.
That the Egyptians worked Bnei Yisrael befarach, and I don't think it's thrown in there, by chance, right? It's saying like this is how you were treated. Don't treat a laborer for you in that way. So what's Sefer Vayikra doing here? And I think it's fascinating, right? It's actually really turning slavery into work for hire. Okay, you can't really have a slave. You can't have a slave. What can you have? Because what would normally happen in this situation where somebody totally loses their land, right? They would then, and has this debt that they have to pay back to you, and they can't support themselves, they would sell themselves to you. And what's this saying? This is saying that
You're not allowed to.
you're not allowed to. And it's even possible, it doesn't make this clear, but it's even possible that if this person found a better job somewhere else, right, that they can go. That's possible. It's unclear, but it's possible.
Right.
Now, why is this important? Okay, and why?
To keep his dignity.
Correct. Okay, so we're definitely talking about keeping people's dignity here, and we are also, if you think about the idea of the relative coming in and the relative being able to help the person. Okay, the relative being able to help the person is not going to solve everything either. First of all, because number one, not everybody has a rich uncle. Okay? Number two, that can very easily lead to the situation in which wealth is then concentrated
In the family.
in like one particular, right? If you have one rich uncle and they're the people who can keep buying this land back, then what happens? Right?
They have the land.
They have the land and you don't, okay? So yes, the land is like in the family, but that's not necessarily
Right,
going to help you. So what do you need? You still need Yovel, where you get your land back. Okay, and you still need a means of supporting yourself until Yovel, which now you have, which is essentially you have a job. Okay.
Does the man have to hire the Jewish
Yeah.
slave? The
Yeah.
Jewish
Yes, it absolutely
Man,
seems like he does.
he
Right?
has
It
to hire him,
absolutely
even
seems
though
like he does.
he failed with the crops. I mean, he may not be
Yeah.
a good hire.
It absolutely seems
Okay.
like he does, which
So
is
that's
very
social
interesting.
justice. That part is.
No, all these laws are social justice, but what I think is fascinating is they're not presented that way, right? And I think that that's so interesting, right? Social justice derives from the fact that we don't own things, God does. And that's that's very different than the way it's presented in Shmot. It's very different than the way it's presented in Tzvarim, where it's very clearly about be good to people, right? This is very interesting. Like, it's clearly about being good to people, but it's, there's this other layer on it, which I think is really interesting. Okay. The last piece of this is, I'm going to have to skip a little bit, I think, because of time, but the last piece of this is about redemption of people. What do we mean redemption of people? So take a look. If you go to Pasuk Mem Zayin, and again, this is all still from the same section in Vayikra. Okay, so the last piece of this, Pasuk Mem Zayin, V'chi tasig yado ger v'toshav imach, mach achicha imo v'nimkar leger toshav imach, ule'eker mishpacha ger. What happens? What if somebody from Bnei Yisrael becomes enslaved by a non-Jew who lives in the area? Well, then what happens? Jews need to redeem Jews. Okay? And then what happens? Your relative needs to come and redeem you, and then you work for your relative. So it's not just this idea of, if these laws don't work because you're going beyond your clan, so then you have to go out of your clan and you have to actually, then there is this obligation on the relative to go ahead and redeem the Jew, and then the Jew kind of enters the household of the relative and works for the relative. Yovel again then becomes a safety net in the case that the person isn't redeemed. So Yovel is for anyone who's in the, right? All Jews who are in the land are going to return to their ancestral portion. And the last pasuk says it very clearly, Ki li v'nei Yisrael avadim, avadai heim asher tzeitu otam me'eretz Mitzrayim. Why? Because Jews cannot be slaves to anybody because they're slaves to God, and that's really how the section ends. Okay, so it's very clear here that the idea of Yovel is God is in charge of everything, we don't own things, and that there are these steps in between, but that can support people. But Yovel's the ultimate safety net, which really gives people a chance to kind of start over again. And we're gonna skip, just because of time, we're gonna skip Yirmiyahu and Nehemiah, but in your spare time you can go read it because it's really interesting. And I want to actually go to the second to last piece here, which is source number 4. If you look at Henry George. So Henry George was a 19th century economist who was fascinatingly, and I did not know this, the original idea of the game Monopoly, which we've been playing a lot of in my house recently, was, it's a really long game, by the way.
There's a fast way you.
Yeah, I know. I got to figure that out. Anyway, I haven't gotten there yet.
You gotta play on Shabbos.
Monopoly.
Sure.
Yeah. But so Henry George was this economist who created what was an antecedent to this game because he wanted to show that if you are a landowner, basically you very quickly become rich, and if you don't own any property, you are poor. And the whole idea of monopoly is all about showing the gap between people who own property and people who don't own property, which I never knew or thought about until I started to look into this, which I thought was very, of course, right? So monopoly is this like game with this real economic, it's got a point to it, and that was his point. So he gave this speech. He's a 19th century American economist, and he gave this speech to the Young Man's Hebrew Association of San Francisco in 1878, called Moses, Apostle of Freedom. And it's actually this amazing, it's worth reading the whole thing. This is obviously not the whole thing, but he presents his own economic theory through the prism of Moshe. Okay? And this is what he says. It's really interesting. It is not the protection of property, but the protection of humanity that is the aim of the Mosaic Code. Its sanctions are not directed to securing the strong and heaping up wealth as much as to preventing the weak from being crowded to the wall. At every point, it interposes its barriers to the selfish greed that, if left unchecked, will surely differentiate men into landlord and serf, capitalist and working person, millionaire and tramp, ruler and ruled. And he points specifically now, it's Sabbath day and Sabbath year, secure even to the lowliest rest and leisure. With a blast of the Jubilee trumpets, the slave goes free. The debt that cannot be paid is canceled, and a redivision of the land secures again to the poorest their fair share in the bounty of the common Creator. The reaper must leave something for the gleaner. Even the ox cannot be muzzled as he treadeth out the corn. Everywhere and everything, the dominant idea is that of our homely phrase, live and let live. And if we seek beneath form and symbol and command, the thought of which they are but the expression, we find that the great distinctive feature of the Hebrew religion, that which separates it by such a wide gulf from the religions amid which it grew up, is its utilitarianism, its recognition of divine law in human life. It asserts not a God whose domain is confined to the far-off beginning or the vague future, who is over, above and beyond humanity, but a God who is in his inexorable laws is here and now, a God of the living as well as the dead, a God of the marketplace as well as of the temple, a God whose judgments wait not another world for execution, but whose immutable decrees will in this life give happiness to the people that heed them and bring misery upon the people that forget them. I love that God of the marketplace as well as of the temple piece, right? Like what he's really saying is these Torah laws were actually meant to be executed, right? And the Torah cares about finances. Why does the Torah care about finances? Because that's how people live. It's not some kind of crazy utopian law, but that's how people live. Moses saw the real cause of the enslavement of the masses of Egypt was what has everywhere produced enslavement, the possession by a class of land upon which and from which the whole people must live. He saw that to permit in land the same unqualified private ownership that by natural right attaches to the things produced by labor would be inevitably to separate the people into the very rich and the very poor, inevitably to enslave labor, to make the few the masters of the many, no matter what the political forms, to bring vice and degradation, no matter what their religion. Meaning, everybody who owns land is going to be rich, and everybody who doesn't own land is going to be poor, eventually. That's what's going to happen. And with the foresight of the philosophic statesman who legislates not for the need of the day, but for all future, he sought a way suited to his times and conditions to guard against this error. Everywhere in the Mosaic institutions is the land treated as the gift of the Creator to his common creatures, which no one has the right to monopolize. Everywhere it is not your estate or your property, not the land which you bought or the land which you conquered, but the land which thy Lord has given thee, the land which the Lord lendeth thee. He not only provided for a redistribution of the land among the people and for making it fallow and common every 7th year, but by the institution of the Jubilee, he provided for a redistribution of the land every 50 years and made monopoly impossible. So there you go. Meaning, what he's essentially saying here is that what does Yovel do? It erases these huge class distinctions by every 50 years resetting the clock and giving people a chance to have land and start again. And I want to end with actually Jacob Milgram, who is a very famous and smart Bible scholar, who wrote a commentary on Sefer Vayikra, who talks about Yovel in the following way. He says nowadays, right? Look at this in a modern context. The debtor world has issued the following demands to the creditor nations. Number 1, cancellation of debts. Number 2, restitution of land and resources to their original owners. Number 3, cessation from pilfering natural resources and polluting them. Number 4, termination of economic slavery by universally raising wages to a subsistence level. Right? Those are kind of pretty common demands that we hear about. And he says the Jubilee, prescribing remission of debts, restoration of land, Sabbath rest for land and people, and release from economic servitude corresponds to all 4 demands, which I thought was a very succinct, nice way of looking at this. And so again, just ending with the idea of Yovel, is both this kind of utopian idea, but is not presented in the Torah at all as a utopian idea. It's presented as a very practical, everybody has the right, everybody should have the right to the means to which to support themselves. And that's really what it's about.
Did this exist until the destruction of the Second Temple?
Okay, good. So the question is, was this actually, do we have any record of Yovel actually being ever practiced, right? So what's interesting, so first of all, Chazal say that Yovel stopped with Galut Shomron. So actually before the destruction of the Second Temple. So that means that Yovel stopped really after slightly before the destruction of the First Temple, actually. The question becomes, we don't have explicit mention of Yovel being practiced. What I put in here, and you can take a look at on your own, are two prakim in Tanakh, which have similar, don't actually say Yovel, but one is a parak of Yirmiyahu, which talks about drawer for avadim. That's source number 2, which talks about slaves going free, and that's in the period right before the destruction of the First Temple. And the second is a parak from Nehemiah, which is in the post-exilic period, where Nehemiah goes back to Eretz Yisrael. He's living in Persia under the reign of Artaxerxes, okay, and he goes back to Eretz Yisrael after the exile, and when he gets there, he institutes something that's kind of similar to Yovel. declaring freedom from debt and abolishing slavery. He does not use the word Yovel. There have been scholars who have tried to trace these two mentions and have tried to figure out that actually they were part of 50-year cycles, and then said that, hey, it actually makes sense that this is, if you do a real counting, that these would have happened in what would have been a Yovel year. But there's no mention, we don't have a definitive answer to that question because we don't really have a real mention of Yovel being enacted, although these two parties are interested in that they're somewhat similar too. All right, thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Very interesting.